I've always wanted Slash's BC Rich Mockingbird, but they don't make them like that anymore. So I bought this Mockingbird, and I'm gonna see if I can turn it into Slash's classic 1980s Mockingbird. Shall I say Mockingbird anymore? I've bought a heat gun to strip the paint, some sanding stuff, and some nitro paint and gloss lacquer, as well as a new decal for the headstock because on Slashers it's just the R. Now I've not decided yet, but I might even change the tuners as well. Now I've never done this before, so I'm very nervous because once I start, I can't stop and I could completely ruin it. So I thought I'd bring you along for the ride and you can laugh at me if it all goes horribly wrong, but please don't. Go easy on me, please. So this is pretty much the closest thing you can get to Slash's iconic BC Rich Mockingbird without spending upwards of $7,500. This is a 2008 model with the Floyd Rose transparent red. The back looks fantastic. That's really nice. But the thing is, it's a little bit too dark for me. As you can see in certain lights, it doesn't stand out. It's not as striking as Slash's version. And this quilted flame top veneer that they've put on top looks really nice in some lights. But it's just, you know, it's just not the one. So before you jump in and just start stripping the guitar and taking all the hardware off, it's really important to make sure that you tag everything somehow. I just put masking tape on everything and wrote on the masking tape what the things were and where they belonged to and which way round it belonged, because when you've got a heap of parts, it's difficult to distinguish what those parts are and where they go. And it's gonna help you put the guitar back together again and make sure you don't lose anything. Make sure that it goes in the right place and keep everything in a plastic container. Make sure it's all labeled up. This is especially important when it comes to doing the pickups, especially with this wiring configuration, because if you put something in the wrong place, the guitar controls won't do what they're meant to do. Now, I've never changed a set of pickups in my life, and I did wonder to myself, what have I got myself into? Another thing that you really want to do is take note of all your measurements. Things like your pickup height, your string height, your action, your bridge height, and the height of the floating trem as well. Label it, write it all down, and take photos as well so you can refer to it when you're putting everything back together. Because the last thing you want to do is, if your guitar's set up perfectly the way you want it to, then you come to putting it all back together again and it doesn't feel quite right. It's going to be a pain to try and set it up in the way you had it before. Initially, I was going to use a heat gun to strip the lacquer off the guitar, but after researching, I heard it can be quite difficult to do and possibly cause damage to the guitar, which is repairable, but I didn't want the hassle. So instead, I bought an orbital sander and some different grades of sandpaper to do the job. Now, Mum and Dad are currently doing up a new home, so they said I could use their garage and make a mess, but I don't think they realised just how much of a mess I was going to make, so sorry about that, Mum and Dad. My dad actually did most of the sanding while I wasn't there, which was helpful. Thanks, Dad. I think he knew that I didn't have the patience to do all that myself, so he just got started on it. So what you want to do is tape off the fretboard and any other areas that you don't want paint to get on with painter's tape to make sure nothing gets damaged or gets paint on it. And we started around 60 grit and went all the way up to 240 or 320. I did the front and the back of the guitar body with the sander, but you have to be careful with the edges, so we did those by hand. I didn't want to go too heavy on the grade, but if you start with too fine a sandpaper, it's going to take too long. But if you go too coarse, you'll end up with loads of deep scratches that you'll have to sand out and it'll take even longer. So the idea is to get a good in between and just keep sanding and going up in grades until you end up with a smooth finish. What I noticed while I was doing the sanding was that Slash's Mockingbird is quite different in shape and it has different contours in the body. And it looks very different to the ST version on closer inspection. But I didn't want to spend too long changing it because it'd probably ruin it and it'd take way too long, and I don't have the skills to be changing the shapes of guitar bodies. So with it being a different colour, it's going to look close enough for me. So the headstock was kind of a light wood effect veneer, but it didn't have the right logo on. So I decided to sand that veneer back. I didn't want to go too far because I wasn't sure if it was going to have the right grain effect underneath that veneer. Even though I was sanding gently, it went through that veneer a little bit, so it unearthed some of the other wood underneath, which I thought was going to be okay because I was going to stain the headstock, grain filler it, and hopefully it was going to end up smooth. So at this point I decided to stain the headstock so it could dry and go a little bit darker, and then I was going to tape it up before the painting phase. Now I made a big error here, and I'll explain that in a bit. Now, I did manage to come up with a fix for this, so make sure you watch the whole video before you start if you're going to copy what I do. So then, after many days of sanding, I then applied the grain filler and sanding sealer. So you basically add grain filler to fill any holes in porous wood grain. Now, because it's got a veneer on this, it didn't need much grain filler, but on the edges, it was a little bit more porous, so I'm glad I did this step. I probably should have done this a little bit more on the headstock, you'll see why later, but I didn't want to change the colour of that headstock in any way whilst staining it. Then the sanding sealer just provides something for the paint to adhere to easier. Then you just give it a little final light sand before you start spraying, and then I taped up the edge of the fretboard where the lacquer was going to be on the sides, because obviously I didn't want to get red on that bit. I also filled the old strap hole with filler and drilled a new hole for a new strap lock because I wanted the placement to match Slash's guitar. Honestly, it's not the most comfortable position when standing. I probably should have left it where it was, but I just wanted it to look like Slash's model. Call me sad, but you know, why not? If you're gonna do it, you may as well go all the way. Before it came on to painting, we had a little bit of an issue because when I was watching videos on people respraying their guitars, most of them are spraying just the body, like a Fender Strat or a Tele type guitar. But something like a Les Paul and the Mockingbird, they've got a neck attached. I was trying to come up with ways that I could rotate the guitar without touching it so that I could spray it on both sides and the corners and stuff. Obviously, I've never done this before. I don't have a proper workshop and all the tools, but we decided the best way was to just stick a screw in one of the strap locks on the body of the guitar and then wrap a chain round it so we could just hang the guitar from the hook in the ceiling. And this enabled us to spin the guitar around when we were spraying, and this was the best solution we could find without having all the pro gear basically. So I started to spray white primer coats. This just helps the main coats to stick better rather than just going on straight to the wood. Now, thing to bear in mind is I chose white because I wanted it to be a nice bright red, but that's gonna have an effect on what your final color ends up like. So choose carefully. If you want a little bit of a darker color, go for black. So if you're applying nitro paint, the technique for spraying is quite tricky. So you want to apply light coats to the guitar and gradually build up the layers. Don't go spraying it on like hairspray. There's a technique to it which is daunting at first, but once you find your rhythm with it, it becomes second nature. Just don't get too close, don't spray too heavy, don't spray in one area for too long. Keep the can moving past the guitar. Do lines across the guitar, starting off the body with the horizontal coat and then a vertical coat so it gets nice coverage and you don't get sort of like squiggly lines. I probably did between 4 and 5 primer coats and only used one can. For the main colour, there were 3 reds that I was trying to decide between: Dakota Red, Fiesta Red, and Translucent Red. I went for Dakota Red, which looked quite dark on all the images, but it actually came out a bit orange looking. And once it dried, it didn't look quite how I wanted it to. So I decided to switch to Trans Red after I'd done the black lines to see if I could get closer to Slash's Mockingbird colour. If you look on Slash's Mockingbird, he's got sort of like black lines, but they're actually pieces of wood, so it's actually wood grain and it's not pure black. And then on the ST model, what it looks like originally is those are actual blocks of wood running through the guitar, but they're in a different place to what Slashers are like. So I decided to spray over those lines and then make my own lines in the same place as Slashers. So I decided that I was gonna use masking tape to just spray my own black lines on there. So I just masked off 2 stripes roughly 8 to 9 mil in width and made sure the rest of the body was masked off before spraying it black. We used 2 different kinds of tape, painter's tape and some modelling tape that my dad had so we could bend it easily around the horns because that was quite tricky. Otherwise your lines end up going parallel around those horns and they wouldn't line up at the other end. So that was quite tricky, but we managed to make it work. I did about 4 or 5 coats of this, then left it to dry for a day or two before removing the tape. And I couldn't believe how well this turned out. I thought there would be overspray everywhere because this was probably going to be the hardest bit. Then it was on to the top coats. As I mentioned, I decided to change the red and go for translucent red for this, so I could paint over the black lines and they would show through. And if you look at slashes, it looks like the black lines have faded slightly, or it's just what you can see of the wood underneath the red coats, and they look more brown. So I couldn't quite get that effect without doing loads more coats, but it looks close enough, so I don't mind. And they'll probably fade over time. I think I used a full can on this and did about 6 to 7 coats, but I'm so glad I switched to trans red because I think the colour is spot on, and you'll see what it looks like in the final reveal. So once all the colour coats had been done, it was time to remove the masking tape so I could apply the gloss. Everything looked okay and the lines along the fretboard were perfect, but when I took the masking tape off the headstock, it pulled some of the wood grain out, and I think it ruined it a little bit, so this was a bit of a problem. I think it's because the masking tape was on there for too long. It'd been on there for a few weeks, and also it was probably a softer wood grain than it was on the fretboard, for example. So just bear that in mind if you're doing this. And it didn't seem like it had gone too deep, so I just thought I'd sand it back a bit, stain it again, and then I just moved on with the gloss. And it's amazing how much of a difference the gloss coats make to the colour and the look of the guitar. It's really bringing out that shine now. But the thing is, my advice here is to put way more coats on than you think you need, and just be patient. I wanted to finish this as quick as possible because I was getting overexcited and I'm really impatient. I don't know why I started doing this. I used 2 cans, but I wish I'd have done more and built up thicker layers. I'm going to explain why in a little bit. So after waiting 2 weeks, the nitro paint and gloss had hardened nicely, so it was ready to sand and buff. The problem is, it shrinks back into any wood grain, so the headstock looked awful at this point, so I decided to sand it back and stick a wood grain veneer over it. So I just chose one from Amazon that was self-adhesive. I just stuck that to the headstock. I just used sandpaper to go around the edges and make sure that that headstock shape was perfectly flush to the headstock. Then I sprayed the headstock again and had to wait another 2 weeks for it to dry and harden before putting on the decal, and I sprayed some more gloss over that once it had dried so it was protected, and then I had to wait again before sanding and buffing. Nitro paint dries really hard and bobbly, so you have to sand it back so it's smooth like glass before buffing it to a shine. So you use wet and dry sandpaper for this, and you'll need a bowl of warm water with a bit of washing up liquid in it, and then just dip the wet and dry sandpaper in it. This is going to help it glide across the body and not stick and scratch your guitar. So I started with 1500 grit wet and dry, but that was way too fine and it took too long to sand because it wasn't coarse enough. So I switched to 800. This did a much better job. It was much easier to get rid of those bobbles, but it's tricky because you can't see, because there's water on the guitar, you can't really see what you're doing, so you kind of have to just trust and feel what's happening. So my advice here is to test an area on the back of the guitar to see how it's going to turn out, and I decided to buff an area to see what the best method was, and I used a machine buffer, just a cheap one from Amazon, and it came with a load of foam pads and a finishing compound swirl remover. I buffed that area, then wiped it off with a microfiber cloth, so I could see there were a load of little scratches on the paint surface, and I thought maybe there's something in the buffer pads, like a, I don't know, piece of grit or something, piece of dirt that was scratching the surface of the guitar. But I think it was the sandpaper swirls that were showing through. So you have to make sure you do multiple passes with different grit sandpaper, working your way up to a nice smooth finish so that there are no scratches before buffing. However, I quite liked that because it gave it a bit more of an aged, imperfect look. So I wasn't that bothered because I didn't want it to look brand new and I didn't want it to be too shiny. I did all this by hand just to make sure that I wasn't going too heavy and make sure that I wasn't taking any of the edges off. When using the buffer pad, I didn't realise, but the polish actually becomes warm and sticky because the buffer spins so fast, and it heated up the paint and actually burnt off some of the finish, even after I was only holding it there for a few seconds. So be careful not to stay in the same area for too long and don't press on too hard. Keep it moving and don't let that finishing compound harden. But it's so difficult because you can't see what's happening a lot of the time, and there's a fine line between bringing out the shine and taking layers of gloss and even paint off. And you can see in some areas where it's taken layers of paint off, and you can just see the Dakota red and even the white in some areas. So if I were to do this again, I'd definitely spray a lot more coats of paint and gloss. You may also be able to see some areas where there's some orange peel effect, and that basically is where I've not sanded enough of the gloss off because it's still bobbly. But again, it's hard to see what's happening. I didn't want to go too far. I was being really cautious to not go too deep and bring it back to the wood. I'd rather not do enough and have a little bit of a bobble than go too deep. But it's all practice. And as I say, I think having more coats of insurance is going to give you a little bit more peace of mind and allow you to buff and sand it a little bit further. So it was time to put all the hardware back on and the pickups, and I'm so glad I labelled everything up because it made it so much easier to see where everything went back, especially the wires in the pickup cavity. I put the original tuners back on, but I might upgrade them next time I change my strings to the gold Grover tuners just to get it looking a bit closer to Slashers, but for now it'll do. The pickups that came in this guitar sounded alright actually, but I wanted to put some Seymour Duncan Slash 2.0 pickups in. Now I've never changed a pickup in my life, and this is probably one of the most difficult wirings to figure out, so I must be crazy, but I thought I'd give it a go. I'll never use any of the features and all these switches, so I just want to bypass all that and use it like a Les Paul 3-way pickup switch type thing. Configuration. Let me know if you want me to do a video showing you how I wired these pickups. If you're going to do the same thing, comment below and make sure you subscribe to the channel. And to my surprise, I can't believe it worked first time. I managed to get the pickups in the right place. So I'm well chuffed with that, super happy. Worked and they sound great. I'll show you what it sounds like at the end. Once I knew the pickups were in and worked properly, I put all the other hardware on, restrung it, and then I took a cream pickup selector switch off of my Epiphone Les Paul Classic and just used that on here to match Slashers instead of the black one that was there before. And I think I'm about ready to show you. So here's the finished result. When you see the guitar hanging up and you've sprayed it and stuff, and you've got the cavities here because the pickups aren't in and the strings aren't on and none of the hardware's on, it looks a bit odd. When all of that goes on and you put the strings on and the pickups are in, it completely transforms the guitar and it looks phenomenal. I'm so happy how it turned out. Now, if you look closely, there are imperfections, but once you start playing it, or you see it on the wall, or in videos and pictures and stuff, you forget about all those imperfections and you just play it. Because it doesn't matter. How often do you look at all the little details of your guitar? You don't really. So, you know, if you were to be here right now and you looked in the light, you'd probably think, so what have you done? But for my first go, I don't think it's that bad. If I were to give you one piece of advice, it would be to use more paint. Apply more layers than you think you're gonna need. Build those layers up nice and thick so that you can buff it and not worry about going too deep. Or get someone to do it who knows what they're doing, basically. I know you're probably curious to hear what it sounds like, so should we hear it? Should we give it a blast? I realise I've gone quite quick through this explanation of doing this guitar, so if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments section below and I'll do my best to get back to you. Oh, I also got this original 1987 Gibson Les Paul and had it finished and relicked just like Slash's Jessica. So if you want to know more about this, I've got a video coming very soon, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell so that you don't miss anything. And if you want to learn how to play like Slash and get his iconic tone, I've got plenty of videos on the way, but in the meantime, check this video out here and I shall see you in the next one.